The letter arrived in Miles City, Montana, on a Tuesday morning in late September 1884, and Marshal Tucker Edwards stood at the post office counter staring at the envelope, addressed in 4 different handwritings as though it might bite him. He had not expected an answer, had in fact spent the past 3 weeks convincing himself that posting that damned advertisement had been the foolish act of a desperate man who did not know the first thing about raising daughters. Yet here it was, postmarked from Philadelphia, written in a neat, careful hand that spoke of education and refinement, 2 qualities sorely lacking in his rough household of grief and confusion. His daughters had written to every unmarried woman whose name they could find in the matrimonial sections of newspapers from Boston to San Francisco. 4 little girls ranging in age from 5 to 12, motherless for 8 months now, had taken matters into their own hands when they found their father staring hollow-eyed at the supper table for the 100th night in a row. The eldest, Margaret, had been the ringleader. She had composed the letters while her sisters added their own pleas in the margins, their misspelled words and crooked sentences painting a picture of loneliness that apparently moved at least one woman to respond. Marshal Edwards, called Tucker by everyone who knew him, was 32 years old and had never imagined himself a widower. His wife Sarah had died bringing their 5th child into the world, a son who lived only 3 hours before following his mother into whatever came after. Tucker had buried them together in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Miles City, had stood there with his 4 daughters clinging to his coat, and had felt something fundamental break inside his chest that he did not think would ever heal properly. Now he walked back to the small house at the edge of town, the letter burning a hole in his jacket pocket. The September sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the dusty street. Miles City had grown considerably since the railroad arrived, transforming from a rough frontier outpost into something resembling civilization, though the saloons still outnumbered the churches and gunfights broke out with enough regularity to keep Tucker busy in his role as marshal. The girls were waiting for him when he pushed through the front door. Margaret stood by the stove attempting to salvage whatever she had been cooking, her face smudged with flour. 10-year-old Ruth sat at the table mending one of her younger sister's dresses with stitches that would have made Sarah weep. 8-year-old Pearl was supposed to be watching 5-year-old Grace, but both girls came running the moment they heard their father's footsteps. Did anyone write back? Margaret asked, abandoning her cooking entirely. Her eyes, so like her mother's that Tucker sometimes had to look away, were bright with desperate hope. Tucker pulled the letter from his pocket and watched 4 faces transform with joy. "Just one," he said quietly. From a woman in Philadelphia named Willa Emerson. Pearl grabbed for the envelope, but Margaret was faster. She tore it open with shaking fingers and began to read aloud. The letter was remarkable in its honesty. Willa Emerson was 24 years old, a schoolteacher who had been engaged until her fiancé died in a factory accident the previous year. She had no family left in Philadelphia, no particular ties to keep her in the East, and she admitted frankly that the idea of starting fresh in Montana territory appealed to her sense of adventure as much as her practical need for security and purpose. "She sounds smart," Ruth said, peering over Margaret's shoulder at the neat handwriting. "She sounds lonely," Tucker said, but not unkindly. He understood loneliness. It had been his constant companion since Sarah died, a weight he carried through every day, through every attempt to cook meals and comb hair and answer the questions that little girls asked their fathers when they had no mothers to turn to. "Will you write back?" Margaret demanded. "Will you ask her to come?" Tucker looked at his daughters, at their hopeful faces and their too thin frames, and the desperate way they clung to this possibility of having a mother again. He thought about the duties he was failing at, the way Grace cried for her mama in the night and he had no comfort to offer, the way Margaret was turning into a little adult before his eyes because someone had to hold the household together. "I will write back," he said finally. "But you girls need to understand something. This does not mean she will come, and even if she does, it does not mean she will stay. We are strangers to her, and she is a stranger to us. Marriage is not something to be entered into lightly, especially not like this." "Mama would want us to have a new mother," Pearl said with the confidence of a child who believed she understood the mysteries of death and love. "She told me once that if anything ever happened to her, she wanted you to find someone to help take care of us." Tucker felt his throat tighten. Sarah had said that in the last weeks before Grace was born, when she had some premonition of what was coming. He had refused to listen then, had told her nothing would happen, that she would be fine. He had been wrong. That night, after the girls were finally asleep in the 2 bedrooms they shared, Tucker sat at the kitchen table with a lantern and a piece of paper and tried to compose a response. His handwriting was rough, formed during childhood by a father who valued work over education, but he did his best to write clearly. He told Willa Emerson about his daughters, about their ages and personalities, about the town of Miles City and what life here entailed. He told her he was a marshal, that the job came with danger but also with a steady salary and a house that was small but sturdy. He told her he was looking for a wife who would love his daughters and help him raise them into good women, and that, in return, he would provide for her and protect her, and treat her with respect and kindness. He did not tell her that he still loved his first wife, that he woke up some mornings expecting to see Sarah beside him, and felt the loss all over again when he remembered. He did not tell her that he was afraid of remarrying, afraid of betraying Sarah's memory, afraid that no other woman could ever fill the space she had left behind. Those fears were his to carry, not burdens to place on a stranger who was considering uprooting her entire life to help him. The correspondence continued through October and into November. Willa's letters arrived every week, each one revealing more of her character. She wrote about her childhood in Philadelphia, about losing her parents to cholera when she was 16, about working her way through normal school to become a teacher. She wrote about her students, and the books she loved, and her opinions on everything from women's suffrage to the proper way to make bread. She was intelligent and witty, and surprisingly frank about her expectations for marriage. Tucker found himself looking forward to her letters with an intensity that surprised him. He would sit at the kitchen table after the girls went to bed and read her words by lamplight, hearing her voice in his head, though they had never spoken. She had sent a photograph, a formal portrait that showed a woman with dark hair pulled back severely, serious eyes, and a mouth that looked like it might smile easily under different circumstances. She was handsome rather than beautiful, but there was something in her expression that drew him, a strength and determination that he recognized in himself. The girls were thoroughly in love with her before she ever agreed to come. They would gather around each new letter, making Margaret read it aloud twice, asking questions about Philadelphia and whether Miss Emerson liked horses, and if she knew any good stories. Tucker watched his daughters come back to life in small increments, watched hope restore some of the light that grief had stolen, and he knew he could not refuse them this chance even if his own heart was not ready. In early December, Willa sent a telegram. She would arrive in Miles City on the 20th, in time for Christmas. If Tucker was agreeable, they could marry shortly after the new year, giving them both a few weeks to be certain of their decision. The telegram was practical and straightforward, like everything about her, but Tucker's hands shook as he held it. The girls threw themselves into preparations with the focused intensity of generals planning a campaign. Margaret and Ruth cleaned the house from top to bottom, scrubbing floors and washing windows until everything gleamed. Pearl picked wildflowers from the last spots they grew despite the cold and dried them to make sachets. Grace, too young to help much, mostly got in everyone's way but did so with such enthusiasm that no one had the heart to scold her. Tucker found himself cleaning as well, fixing the broken hinge on the bedroom door, patching the hole in the roof that let rain in during storms, building a new bookshelf because Willa had mentioned loving to read. He bought new curtains for the windows, softer and prettier than the plain ones Sarah had made years ago, and tried not to feel guilty about replacing them. He went to the general store and purchased fabric for a new dress for each of his daughters, wanting them to look their best when they met the woman who might become their mother. On the evening of December 19th, Tucker stood in front of the mirror in his bedroom and tried to make himself presentable. He had gotten a haircut and a shave, had put on his best shirt, and the coat he wore to church on the rare Sundays he made it there. He looked older than 32, he thought. The past year had carved lines around his eyes and mouth, had threaded gray through his dark hair. He wondered what Willa Emerson would think when she saw him, whether the reality would disappoint after months of letters. "You look handsome, Papa," Margaret said from the doorway. She had grown so much in the past year, shooting up like a weed, her childhood falling away in pieces. At 12, she was already showing signs of the woman she would become, and Tucker felt a pang at how much Sarah was missing. "Thank you, sweetheart," he said, turning from the mirror. "Are your sisters ready?" "We have been ready for hours," Margaret said with the dramatic exasperation of youth. "When do we leave for the station?" "The train arrives at 8 in the morning," Tucker said. "We will leave at 7:30, which means you girls need to get to sleep soon so you are not exhausted tomorrow." Getting the girls to sleep proved impossible. Tucker could hear them whispering and giggling in their rooms long past the time they should have been quiet. He lay in his own bed, staring at the ceiling, and wondered what the hell he was doing. He was about to marry a woman he had never met, based on nothing but letters and desperation. It was madness. It was the act of a man who had run out of options. It was also, he thought, perhaps the bravest thing he had done since pinning on the marshal's badge. The train was late, which gave Tucker and his daughters an extra hour to stand on the platform in the bitter December cold, nerves stretched tight. Miles City's train depot was a modest affair, just a platform and a small building where tickets were sold. But it represented connection to the wider world, proof that Montana territory was no longer the absolute edge of civilization. When the train finally appeared, belching smoke and cinders into the gray morning sky, Pearl grabbed Tucker's hand and squeezed hard enough to hurt. Grace buried her face in his coat. Margaret and Ruth stood straight and proper, but Tucker could see the fear mixed with their excitement. This woman could change everything, for good or ill. They were balanced on the edge of the unknown. Passengers began disembarking, mostly men heading to the cattle ranches or mining operations, a few families looking rumpled and exhausted from their journey. Tucker scanned each face, looking for the woman from the photograph. Then she stepped down from the train car, a worn carpet bag in one hand and a larger trunk being handed down by the porter, and Tucker felt his heart do something complicated in his chest. Willa Emerson was smaller than he had imagined, perhaps 5 feet and 3 inches in her traveling boots, with dark hair escaping from beneath her sensible hat after the long journey. Her coat was shabby but clean, her gloves mended but proper. She looked around the platform with wide eyes, taking in the rough frontier town with an expression Tucker could not quite read. Then her gaze found his, recognition sparking because he too had sent a photograph, and she went very still. For a moment they simply stared at each other across the platform, two strangers who had agreed to bind their lives together. Then Margaret, bless her brave heart, broke away from Tucker's side and walked straight up to Willa. "Miss Emerson," she said, her voice only shaking a little. "I am Margaret. We wrote to you." Willa looked down at the girl and her entire face transformed. She smiled, and it was like the sun coming out from behind clouds, warm and genuine and slightly tremulous. "Margaret," she said softly, "I am so very pleased to meet you." Then Ruth and Pearl were there too, and even Grace overcame her shyness enough to peek out from behind Tucker's coat. Willa knelt down on the platform, heedless of the dirt and soot, and spoke to each girl by name, asking questions and listening to their eager answers as though they were the most important people in the world. Tucker approached slowly, giving them their moment. When Willa finally stood and turned to face him, he removed his hat and tried to find words that felt adequate. "Miss Emerson," he said, "welcome to Miles City. I hope the journey was not too difficult." "Marshal Edwards," she replied, and her voice was lower than he had expected, with a slight rasp that suggested she had been talking or singing on the train. "Thank you for meeting me, and please call me Willa. I think we are well past formality given the circumstances." "Tucker," he said, and held out his hand. She took it, her grip firm despite the cold, and he felt the calluses on her palm that spoke of work and hardship. This was no pampered Eastern lady expecting an easy life. This was a woman who understood survival. They collected her trunk and walked back toward the house, the girls chattering around Willa like birds, pointing out landmarks and telling her about the town. Tucker carried the trunk and watched Willa take in Miles City with eyes that missed nothing. He saw her note the saloons and the muddy streets, the rough men standing outside the general store, the few respectable women who stared at her with undisguised curiosity. He saw her shoulders straighten, her chin lift, and he recognized the gesture. She was refusing to be intimidated. The house looked better than it had in months, thanks to the girls' efforts, but Tucker still felt a wave of embarrassment as he opened the front door. It was small and plain, nothing like what she must have been used to in Philadelphia. The furniture was handmade and worn, the floors were bare wood, the whole place spoke of poverty and making do, but Willa walked in and looked around with an expression of relief. "It is lovely," she said, and sounded like she meant it. "Warm and welcoming. You have done well, girls." Margaret beamed. Ruth actually blushed. Pearl grabbed Willa's hand and began dragging her toward the room she shared with Grace, chattering about the curtains they had washed and the flowers they had dried. Tucker watched them go and felt something in his chest loosen slightly. Maybe this would work. Maybe it would be all right. They gave Willa the small room that had been Sarah's sewing room, the only private space in the house besides Tucker's bedroom. She unpacked her few belongings while the girls hovered in the doorway asking questions. Tucker made coffee and tried to think about what came next. They had agreed to marry after the new year, but that was still 2 weeks away. 2 weeks of living together as strangers, of learning each other's habits and quirks, of deciding if this practical arrangement could become something more. Over coffee at the kitchen table, Tucker laid out the plan he had been forming. "You should have time to settle in," he said. "To get to know the girls and the town. I will sleep on the sofa until after we are married. The girls know we are to wed, but I want everything to be proper." Willa nodded, her hands wrapped around the coffee cup for warmth. "I appreciate that," she said. "And I want to be useful. I have been a teacher for 6 years. I could start helping the girls with their lessons right away, and I am a fair hand at cooking and cleaning." "You are not a servant," Tucker said sharply, then softened his tone. "I mean, you do not need to prove your worth by working yourself to exhaustion. You have just traveled halfway across the country. Take some time to rest." "I am not good at resting," Willa admitted with a small smile. "And honestly, I would rather be busy. It helps me think less about how strange all of this is." Tucker understood that. He had worked himself nearly to death after Sarah died, taking extra shifts, volunteering for the dangerous jobs, anything to avoid the quiet moments when grief could catch him. The first few days were awkward, all of them learning to navigate the presence of a stranger in their home. Willa was up before dawn, helping Margaret make breakfast, teaching Ruth better stitching techniques, reading to Pearl and Grace from the books she had brought from Philadelphia. She moved through the house like she was trying to memorize it, learning where everything belonged, asking permission before changing anything. Tucker watched her with his daughters and felt his resistance crumbling. She was patient with Grace's endless questions, firm but kind when Pearl tried to shirk her chores, encouraging with Ruth, who was shy and quiet, and treated Margaret like the young woman she was becoming rather than a child. She did not try to replace their mother, but she made space for herself in their lives with a gentleness that touched something deep in Tucker's guarded heart. On Christmas Eve, Tucker came home from his rounds to find the house transformed. Willa and the girls had made paper chains and hung them from the ceiling. They had found a small pine tree and decorated it with the dried flowers Pearl had made and with strings of cranberries that perfumed the air. There were cookies cooling on the table, filling the house with scents of cinnamon and sugar, and someone had been singing because he could hear the last fading notes as he opened the door. "Papa," Grace launched herself at him, covered in flour and happiness. "Miss Willa taught us Christmas carols. The ones her mama used to sing." Willa appeared from the kitchen, her face flushed from the heat of the stove, her hair coming loose from its pins. She looked younger like this, less guarded, and Tucker felt his breath catch. "I hope you do not mind," she said. The girls wanted to make the house festive. "I do not mind," Tucker said, and realized he meant it. For the first time since Sarah died, the house felt alive again. That night, after the girls were in bed, Tucker and Willa sat together in the small parlor, the paper chains casting shadows in the lamplight. They had fallen into the habit of talking after the children slept, sharing stories about their pasts, learning the shapes of each other's lives. "I want to be honest with you," Tucker said, staring at his hands. "I am not sure I know how to be a husband again. Sarah and we grew up together. We learned everything side by side. With you, it is all different. I am afraid of disappointing you." Willa was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was gentle. "I am afraid too," she admitted. "I am afraid the girls will never truly accept me, that I will never measure up to their real mother. I am afraid you will regret this arrangement, that you will look at me one day and wish I was someone else." Tucker looked at her then, really looked, and saw the vulnerability she usually kept hidden. "Sarah was a good woman," he said slowly. "I loved her deeply, and I will not pretend otherwise, but she is gone, and grief is not something I want to live with forever. You are not here to replace her. You are here to help me build something new." "Can you do that?" Willa asked. "Build something new while still honoring what you had?" "I think I have to try," Tucker said. "For the girls, if nothing else, they deserve a real family, not just a father going through the motions." "And what about you?" Willa's dark eyes were serious in the lamplight. "What do you deserve?" Tucker had not let himself think about that, about what he wanted beyond his daughter's happiness. But looking at Willa now, at her intelligence and strength and the careful kindness she showed his children, he felt something stir that he had thought was dead. Not love, not yet, but the possibility of it. I think, he said carefully, I deserve a chance to be happy again. We both do. They were married on January 3rd, 1885, in the small church at the center of Miles City. The girls wore their new dresses and stood witness with the town doctor and his wife. Reverend Palmer kept the ceremony brief, understanding that this was a practical union more than a romantic one, but Tucker spoke his vows with complete sincerity. He promised to honor and protect Willa, to provide for her, to treat her as a true wife in every sense. Willa's voice shook slightly as she made her own promises, but her gaze was steady on his. When Tucker slipped the simple gold band onto her finger, purchased with money he had been saving for emergencies, her smile was radiant. The girls cried happy tears. Margaret hugged Willa fiercely. Ruth tucked her small hand into Willa's as they walked out of the church. Pearl chattered about now having a real mother again, and Grace asked if she could call Willa Mama, which made Willa's eyes fill with tears. She blinked away quickly. There was no honeymoon, no grand celebration. They returned to the house and shared a simple meal. And that night, Tucker carried his few belongings into the room that Willa had been occupying, the room that would now be theirs together. They prepared for bed in awkward silence, both acutely aware that they were strangers about to share the most intimate of spaces. Tucker changed into his nightshirt in the corner while Willa sat at the small vanity, brushing out her long dark hair. In the lamplight, with her hair down and her shoulders relaxed, she looked younger and more vulnerable than he had yet seen her. "We do not have to," Tucker said quietly, standing by the bed. "I know this is not a typical marriage. We can take our time." Willa set down her brush and turned to face him. "Tucker," she said, his name still a little foreign in her mouth, "I came here knowing what marriage meant. I am not afraid of you. I am just nervous because I do not want to disappoint you." "You could not," Tucker said with absolute certainty. "You have already given my daughters back their joy. That is more than I had any right to hope for." She stood and crossed to him, small and determined in her white nightgown. "I want this to be a real marriage," she said, "not just a business arrangement. I want to build a life with you if you are willing." Tucker reached out and cupped her face gently, his rough hands careful against her soft skin. "I am willing," he said, and kissed her for the first time. It was tentative and sweet, nothing like the passionate kisses he had shared with Sarah in their youth, but it held its own promise. Willa's lips were soft, her hands coming up to rest on his chest, and Tucker felt warmth spread through him that had nothing to do with desire and everything to do with connection. When they parted, both were breathing a little faster. "We will figure this out together," Tucker said, smoothing her hair back from her face. "Everything else, we have been managing step by step. This can be the same." They lay down together, and Tucker gathered Willa into his arms with a tenderness that surprised them both. She fit against him like she belonged there, her head on his shoulder, her hand over his heart. They did not rush into passion, but instead talked quietly in the darkness, sharing fears and hopes, learning the feel of each other's presence. When they finally came together, it was gentle and careful, both of them nervous and uncertain but willing to be vulnerable. Tucker had been afraid that being with Willa would feel like a betrayal, but instead it felt like healing, like a door opening onto possibilities he had thought were closed forever. Willa trembled in his arms, and he held her close, murmuring reassurances, trying to make her first time as a married woman something tender rather than frightening. Afterward, they lay tangled together in the narrow bed, Willa's head on Tucker's chest, his fingers trailing through her hair. "Thank you," she whispered, "for being patient, for being kind. You are my wife," Tucker said simply. "That means something to me. You mean something to me." He felt her smile against his skin, "You mean something to me too," she said. "More than I expected when I got on that train in Philadelphia." They fell asleep like that, wrapped around each other, two lonely people who had found unexpected comfort in an arranged marriage. The winter months passed in a blur of domesticity and adjustment. Willa took over the household with quiet efficiency, freeing Tucker to focus on his duties as marshal without worrying that his daughters were being neglected. She established routines and schedules, made sure the girls did their lessons and their chores, cooked meals that were substantial and nourishing. The house began to feel like a home again rather than just a place where sad people lived. But it was more than just the practical improvements. Willa brought laughter back into their lives. She had a dry wit that caught Tucker by surprise, making him chuckle over supper about some incident in town. She played games with the girls in the evenings, teaching them card games and word puzzles from her own childhood. She sang while she worked, hymns and folk songs that filled the house with music. Tucker found himself watching her when she did not notice, memorizing the way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the little frown of concentration when she was sewing, the smile that transformed her serious face when one of the girls did something amusing. He caught himself looking forward to coming home at the end of the day, anticipating the warmth of her greeting, the touch of her hand on his arm, the conversations they shared after the children were asleep. It happened so gradually he did not notice at first. But one evening in late February, Tucker came home to find Willa teaching Margaret how to make bread, their hands covered in flour, both of them laughing at some private joke. Ruth was reading to Pearl and Grace by the fire, all three girls cuddled together. The house was warm and bright and full of life, and Tucker stood in the doorway and realized with a jolt that he was happy. More than that, he was falling in love with his wife. It was different from what he had felt for Sarah. That had been the passionate, uncomplicated love of youth. Two people growing up together with no complications or history between them. This was the love of two adults who had both known loss and hardship, who had chosen each other deliberately and were building something together from the ground up. It was quieter than his first love, but no less real. Willa looked up and saw him standing there, and her face lit up with a smile that made his heart turn over in his chest. "You are home early," she said, coming to greet him. She had flour on her cheek, and her sleeves rolled up to her elbows, and she looked absolutely beautiful. Tucker pulled her close, heedless of the flour, and kissed her properly. He felt her surprise, then her pleased response, her arms coming around his neck. The girls made exaggerated gagging noises, and Willa laughed against his mouth. What was that for? She asked when they parted, her cheeks flushed. "Just glad to be home," Tucker said, which was the truth but not all of it. He was not quite ready to say the words yet, was not sure if she felt the same way, but he wanted her to know that this had become more than a practical arrangement, at least for him. Spring came to Montana territory in fits and starts, cold mornings giving way to warmer afternoons, the first green shoots pushing up through the last patches of snow. With the better weather came increased work for Tucker. Cattle rustlers were active in the area, and there had been a series of thefts from ranches outside town. He found himself spending long days trekking suspects, coming home exhausted and frustrated. Willa never complained about his absences, just had hot food waiting and listened patiently when he needed to talk through the cases. She was a good sounding board, asking intelligent questions that sometimes helped him see angles he had missed. More than once, her insights proved valuable in solving a problem. But the danger of his job became starkly real one April afternoon, when Tucker confronted three rustlers on the Denison Ranch, and shots were fired. He took a bullet in his left shoulder, Nothing life-threatening but painful and bleeding heavily. By the time he got himself back to town and to the doctor's office, he had lost enough blood that his vision was graying at the edges. Doc Morrison patched him up efficiently, digging out the bullet and bandaging the wound, but insisted that Tucker stay off duty for at least a week. "You are lucky," the doctor said bluntly. "Another few inches to the right and that bullet would have hit something vital. Go home to your wife, Marshal. Let her take care of you." Tucker walked home slowly, his arm in a sling, trying to figure out how to tell Willa what had happened without frightening her. But news traveled fast in a town the size of Miles City, and she was waiting on the porch when he arrived, her face white and her hands clenched in her apron. "They said you were shot," she said, her voice shaking. "They said you were at the doctor's office, and I have been standing here for 20 minutes trying to decide if I should come find you or wait here with the girls, and I thought—" Her voice broke. "I thought you might be dead." Tucker had never seen her lose her composure like this. Willa was always controlled, always steady, but now she was trembling all over and there were tears in her eyes. He realized with a shock that she was terrified. "I am all right," he said quickly, moving toward her. "It is just a shoulder wound. Doc says I will be fine." Willa grabbed his good arm, her fingers digging in hard enough to bruise. "You could have died," she said, and now the tears were falling freely. "You could have died and I would have lost you, and I cannot do that, Tucker. I cannot lose you." "Willa," he started, but she cut him off. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I was not supposed to, I know that. This was supposed to be practical and sensible. And I was not supposed to fall in love with you, but I did, and now you are getting shot, and I am so frightened. And I do not know what I would do if—" Tucker kissed her, cutting off her frantic words. He kissed her hard and deep, pouring everything he felt into it, and when they broke apart he pressed his forehead to hers. "I love you too," he said roughly. "I have been falling in love with you since Christmas, and I was waiting for the right moment to tell you, and I am an idiot because there is no right moment. There is only now. I love you, Willa, not because you are good with my daughters or because you make my life easier, but because you are you. Because you are brave and strong and kind, and you make me want to be a better man." Willa sobbed once and threw her arms around him, careful of his injured shoulder. Tucker held her as tightly as he could manage with one arm, breathing in the scent of her hair, feeling her heart racing against his chest. "Do not die on me," she whispered. "Please, Tucker, I just found you. Do not leave me alone." "I will do my best," he promised, and meant it with everything in him. The girls came tumbling out then, drawn by the commotion, and there were more tears and hugs and scolding about being more careful. Tucker let himself be fussed over. Let Willa and Margaret settle him in bed with pillows propped behind him. Let Ruth bring him tea and Pearl read to him, while Grace climbed carefully onto the bed to cuddle against his good side. That night, after the girls were finally asleep, Willa came to bed and curled against Tucker's uninjured side. "I have been thinking," she said quietly, "about what you do, about the risks you take. I knew you were a marshal when I agreed to marry you, but I do not think I really understood what that meant." "Are you asking me to quit?" Tucker asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. He would do it if she asked, would find other work, but being marshal was part of who he was. "No," Willa said. "I would never ask that, but I am asking you to be careful, to not take unnecessary risks. Because you have people who need you to come home alive, not just your daughters. Me too, I need you." Tucker kissed the top of her head. "I will be as careful as I can be," he promised. "And maybe when the town council hires that deputy they keep talking about, I can let him handle some of the more dangerous work." They lay in silence for a while, Tucker's hand stroking Willa's hair in the darkness. Then she spoke again, her voice soft and wondering. "I never imagined this," she said. "When I got on that train in Philadelphia, I thought I was going to a loveless marriage of convenience. I thought I would be a housekeeper and a governess with a wedding ring. I never thought I would find this." "Find what?" Tucker asked, though he thought he knew. "Home," Willa said simply. "A real home with a man I love and children I adore, family, belonging. Everything I lost when my parents died, I found again here with you." Tucker felt his throat tighten with emotion. "You gave me the same thing," he said. "You brought me back to life when I thought I was just going through the motions. You and the girls, you are my whole world." "Then we are very lucky people," Willa said, and Tucker could hear the smile in her voice. "The luckiest," he agreed, and held her close until they both fell asleep. Summer arrived in full force, bringing long days and hard work. Tucker recovered from his shoulder wound and returned to his duties, though he was more cautious now, more aware of the fear he saw in Willa's eyes when he left for dangerous calls. The town council finally hired a deputy, a young man named Sam Porter who was eager and competent, and Tucker found himself delegating more than he had in the past. Willa continued teaching the girls, but she also started helping out at the town's small schoolhouse a few days a week when the regular teacher was overwhelmed with the number of students. She had a gift for education, patient and creative in her methods, and the children adored her. Tucker would sometimes stop by during his rounds and watch through the window as she led a classroom full of rowdy frontier children through their lessons, maintaining order with nothing but her presence and her calm authority. In late July, Willa began feeling unwell. She was tired all the time, nauseous in the mornings, and Margaret, who was nearly 13 and understood things about women's bodies, caught Tucker in the barn one evening with a knowing look. "Papa," she said seriously, "I think Miss Willa might be expecting a baby." Tucker went very still. He and Willa had not been careful about preventing pregnancy, but he had not let himself think too much about the possibility. Another child meant another risk, another chance for loss. He had buried one wife in childbirth. The thought of going through that again with Willa made him feel physically ill. "Does she know?" he asked. "I think she suspects," Margaret said, "but she has not said anything. I think she is worried about how you will react." Tucker found Willa in the garden, weeding in the evening light. She looked up when she heard his footsteps, and he saw the uncertainty in her eyes, the fear she was trying to hide. "Margaret thinks you might be pregnant," he said without preamble. Willa stood slowly, brushing dirt from her hands. "I think I might be," she admitted. "I have missed my courses twice now, and I have all the signs. But Tucker, I know you are frightened. I know what happened with Sarah. We can talk to Doc Morrison. Maybe there are things we can do to make it safer." Tucker crossed to her in 3 long strides and pulled her into his arms, holding her so tightly she squeaked in protest. "I am terrified," he admitted, his voice muffled against her hair. "I am absolutely terrified of losing you, but I am also happy. We made a child together, Willa. That is a miracle, not a curse." "You are happy," Willa pulled back to look at his face. "Truly, truly," Tucker said. "Terrified but happy. We will do everything we can to keep you safe. Doc Morrison is a good doctor, probably the best in Montana territory, and you are young and strong. This does not have to end the way it did with Sarah." "I am going to be very large and uncomfortable and irritable," Willa warned, but she was smiling. "And then there will be a screaming infant keeping us up all night. Are you certain you are ready for that again?" "With you, I am ready for anything," Tucker said and kissed her. They told the girls that night, and there was an explosion of excitement. The idea of a new baby brother or sister sent Pearl and Grace into raptures. Ruth was quietly pleased, already planning how she would help. Margaret was the most serious, pulling Willa aside to ask about her health, to make sure she was being careful, acting like a little mother hen in a way that made Tucker both proud and sad at how fast she was growing up. The pregnancy progressed normally through the summer and into fall. Willa continued her work as long as she could, though Tucker insisted she cut back on the heavy lifting and the long hours. By October, she was obviously pregnant, her belly swelling under her loose dresses, and Tucker found himself watching her constantly, looking for any sign of trouble. Willa bore his worrying with patience, reassuring him daily that she felt fine, that the baby was moving and strong, that Doc Morrison said everything looked good. But Tucker could not shake the fear that lived in his chest, the memory of Sarah bleeding out while he held her hand and begged her not to leave, one night in early November, with winter's first snow falling outside. Willa took Tucker's hand and placed it on her belly. "Feel that?" she asked as the baby kicked against his palm. "That is our child, strong and healthy. I am not Sarah, Tucker. This is not her story. This is ours, and it gets to have a different ending." Tucker wanted to believe her. He tried to believe her, but the fear remained a constant shadow. December came, bringing bitter cold and shorter days. Willa was huge now, moving slowly, her back aching and her patience sometimes fraying. Tucker hovered, driving her to distraction with his constant checking, until she finally snapped at him one evening that she was pregnant, not made of glass, and if he did not stop treating her like she was about to shatter, she would lose her mind. Margaret pulled him aside after supper. "Papa," she said gently, "you need to trust that Miss Willa will be all right. Your fear is making her more anxious, and that is not good for her or the baby." Out of the mouths of babes, Tucker thought. His 12-year-old daughter was right. He was so consumed with his own terror that he was not being the support Willa needed. He found Willa in their bedroom, sitting on the edge of the bed, rubbing her swollen belly. "I am sorry," he said quietly. "I have been thinking more about my fear than about you. That is not fair." Willa looked up at him with tired eyes. "I am frightened too," she admitted. "I would be a fool not to be. But Tucker, I need you to believe we will get through this. I need your strength, not your terror." Tucker knelt in front of her, taking her hands in his. "You are the strongest person I know," he said. "You came halfway across the country to marry a stranger and raise his children. You turned our house back into a home. You made me believe in happiness again. I do not know what I did to deserve you, but I am grateful every day that you answered those letters." "I am grateful too," Willa said, smoothing his hair back from his face. "And I am going to be fine, Tucker. We are going to have a beautiful baby, and I am going to survive the birth, and we are going to raise this child together and grow old together, and none of the terrible things you are imagining are going to happen. Promise me," Tucker said, knowing it was irrational but needing to hear it anyway. "I promise," Willa said solemnly. "I promise to fight with everything I have to stay with you." The labor started on a cold December morning, 3 days before Christmas. Tucker was out on rounds when Margaret came running to find him, breathless and wide-eyed. "Papa, it is time." "Miss Willa sent me to fetch Doc Morrison, but I wanted to tell you first." Tucker's heart dropped into his stomach. "Is she all right? Is there blood? Is something wrong?" "She is fine," Margaret said firmly. "She is handling it better than you are, apparently, but you need to come home." Tucker ran. He left his horse at the hitching post and ran through the snowy streets of Miles City, his breath coming in harsh gasps that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with panic. By the time he reached the house, Doc Morrison was already there, washing his hands in the kitchen while Willa's pained gasps came from the bedroom. "She is doing fine, Tucker," Doc Morrison said calmly. "First babies take a while, could be hours yet. Why do not you wait out here with your daughters?" "I want to be with her," Tucker said. "And I am sure she wants you there," the doctor replied. But let me examine her first, make sure everything is progressing normally. Then you can sit with her between contractions." The next several hours were the longest of Tucker's life. He sat beside Willa's bed, holding her hand through the contractions, wiping the sweat from her face, murmuring encouragement even as his own fear threatened to choke him. She was so small, and the pain was clearly intense, and he kept flashing back to Sarah, to the way things had gone so terribly wrong. But Willa was not Sarah. She was fierce and determined, focusing through each contraction with gritted teeth and clenched fists. Between pains, she would look at Tucker and smile, reassuring him even as she labored to bring their child into the world. "You are doing so well," Tucker told her over and over. "You are so strong. I love you so much." "Love you too," Willa gasped. "Even though you did this to me, and I am never forgiving you." Doc Morrison chuckled from his position at the foot of the bed. "That is what they all say. She will forgive you once she is holding the baby." As evening fell, the contractions intensified. Willa began pushing, her face red with effort, her hand gripping Tucker's so hard he thought his bones might break. He did not care. He would let her break every bone in his body if it helped her through this. "Almost there," Doc Morrison encouraged. "I can see the head. One more good push, Willa." Willa screamed, a sound of such primal effort that it tore at Tucker's heart. Then suddenly there was another sound, a thin wail that cut through everything else, and Doc Morrison was lifting a squirming, blood-covered infant. "It is a boy," he announced. Healthy and strong from the sound of those lungs. Tucker stared at his son, at the tiny perfect human that he and Willa had created, and felt tears streaming down his face. "A boy," he repeated stupidly. "Is he all right?" Willa asked weakly. "Is he healthy?" "He is perfect," Doc Morrison said, wrapping the baby in a clean blanket and handing him to Willa. "And so are you. No complications, clean delivery. You did beautifully." Willa cradled the baby against her chest, her exhausted face transformed with wonder. "Hello, little one," she whispered. "We have been waiting for you." Tucker leaned down and kissed Willa's forehead, his tears falling onto her skin. "You did it," he said brokenly. "You are all right. You both are all right." "I told you," Willa said with a tired smile. "Different story, different ending." They named him Matthew James Edwards, and he was the most beautiful thing Tucker had ever seen. The girls were allowed in to meet their baby brother, and even Margaret, who had been trying so hard to seem grown up, dissolved into tears of joy at the sight of him. Christmas that year was the best Tucker could remember. The house was full of laughter and love. A new baby sleeping in a cradle by the fire, 4 girls who were happy and thriving, and a wife who had given him everything. On Christmas morning, Tucker pulled Willa close while Matthew nursed and the girls played with their simple gifts, and he felt gratitude so profound it was almost painful. "Thank you," he said quietly, for perhaps the 100th time since Matthew's birth. "For what?" Willa asked, though her smile said she knew. "For answering the letters, for getting on the train, for taking a chance on us, for giving me a son, for being alive and well and here, for everything." Willa shifted Matthew to her shoulder and leaned against Tucker. "You know what I realized?" she said. "When your daughters wrote those letters, they were praying for a mother, but they gave me so much more than I gave them. They gave me a family. They gave me you. So really, I should be thanking them." "Thank God they were such determined little girls," Tucker said, looking at Margaret and Ruth and Pearl and Grace, all of them growing up so fast. "I never would have had the courage to place that advertisement on my own." "Then we owe them everything," Willa agreed. The years that followed were good ones. Tucker continued as marshal with Deputy Porter handling more of the dangerous work. Willa taught at the school and raised their growing family with patience and love. Matthew thrived, a cheerful baby who grew into a curious toddler. Margaret turned into a beautiful young woman, graduating from school with honors and eventually marrying a rancher's son who adored her. Ruth followed her older sister's academic example, becoming a teacher herself. Pearl shocked everyone by announcing she wanted to be a doctor and stubbornly pursuing that dream until she made it reality. Grace, the baby who had lost her mother so young, grew up with no real memory of that loss, knowing only Willa as her mama. In 1887, Willa gave birth to another son, Daniel. In 1889, a daughter they named Clara. The house was always full of noise and chaos and love, sometimes driving Tucker to distraction, but mostly filling him with a contentment he had never expected to feel again. On their 10th wedding anniversary, Tucker took Willa to dinner at Miles City's finest restaurant, a fancy establishment that had opened the previous year. They sat across from each other in their best clothes, looking like respectable middle-aged citizens, and Tucker reached across the table to take his wife's hand. "You ever regret it?" he asked. "Leaving Philadelphia, marrying a stranger, building a life here?" Willa looked at him with those serious dark eyes that had first captured him from a photograph. "Not for a single moment," she said. "Do you regret placing that advertisement? My daughters placed it," Tucker reminded her. "I just let it stand, but no, I do not regret it. Best decision I ever failed to make." Willa laughed, the sound as beautiful to him now as it had been the first time he heard it. "I used to wonder sometimes what my life would have been like if I had not answered their letters. If I had stayed in Philadelphia and eventually married someone else, lived out my days there. And I cannot even imagine it," Willa said. "This is my life. You are my life. Our children, all of them, the ones I carried and the ones I inherited. This town, this house, this whole wild, beautiful existence we built together. I was meant to get on that train, Tucker. I was meant to come here and marry you and become a mother. It was all meant to be." Tucker stood and came around the table, pulling Willa to her feet. Other diners stared as he kissed her right there in the middle of the restaurant, but he did not care. Let them stare. This woman had saved him, had healed his broken heart and given him a future he had not believed possible. "I love you," he said against her lips. "More than I have ever loved anyone or anything." "I love you too," Willa whispered back. "Thank you for being brave enough to let 4 little girls send those letters. Thank you for giving me a chance." They went home that night to their children, to Matthew and Daniel playing in the parlor while Clara slept in her cradle, and the older girls were off living their own lives. Tucker stood in the doorway and watched Willa move through their home, and he thought about how close he had come to never knowing this joy. 4 daughters had prayed for a mother, and in answering their prayer, God had given them all so much more. He had given those little girls a woman who would love and guide them. He had given Willa a purpose and a family, and he had given Tucker a second chance at happiness, a love that was different from his first but no less profound. The years continued to pass in a blur of seasons and milestones. Tucker eventually retired from his position as marshal, turning the job over to Sam Porter, who had proved himself more than capable. He took up ranching instead, buying a small spread outside town where he raised cattle and horses with Matthew and Daniel's help. Willa continued teaching until her hair turned gray and her eyesight began to fail. She retired with honors from the school board and spent her days reading to Clara and her eventual grandchildren, passing on her love of learning to the next generation. Margaret gave them 4 grandchildren. Ruth gave them 3. Pearl, busy with her medical practice in Denver, remained unmarried but came home for holidays bringing gifts and stories from the wider world. Grace married young to a carpenter and settled just down the road, providing Willa with a nearly constant stream of grandchildren to spoil. Matthew grew up to be a fine man who took over the ranch. Daniel became a lawyer and moved to Helena. Clara surprised everyone by becoming a journalist, writing articles about Montana territory that were published in newspapers across the country. Through it all, Tucker and Willa remained devoted to each other. They grew old together, their bodies slowing but their love never diminishing. Tucker's dark hair went white, Willa's face lined with years of laughter and tears. But when they looked at each other, they still saw the strangers who had taken a leap of faith on a cold December day in 1884. On a spring morning in 1912, Tucker woke in the bed he had shared with Willa for 27 years and found her still sleeping beside him. 70 years old now, he moved more slowly than he once had, his joints stiff and his breath sometimes short. But he was content in a way that younger men rarely understood. Willa stirred and opened her eyes, smiling at him in the early morning light. "Good morning, husband," she said, as she had every morning for nearly 3 decades. "Good morning, wife," Tucker replied, kissing her forehead. They rose and dressed and went about their day. Their children were grown and scattered, but many had stayed close enough for regular visits. The little house in Miles City had long since been traded for a larger farmhouse, expanded to accommodate their growing family. As they sat on the porch that evening watching the sunset paint the Montana sky in shades of pink and gold, Tucker took Willa's hand in his. Her fingers were bent with arthritis now, but they still fit perfectly in his grasp. "You remember the first time we met?" he asked. "On the train platform, both of us scared to death. I remember thinking you were even more handsome than your photograph," Willa said with a smile, "and being terrified that I had made a terrible mistake." "Best mistake either of us ever made," Tucker said. "Not a mistake," Willa corrected gently. "A blessing. 4 little girls praying for a mother, and I got to be the answer to their prayers. How many people get to say that?" Tucker pulled her close, breathing in the scent of her that had become as familiar as his own. "I love you, Willa Edwards. Today and every day until I draw my last breath." "And I love you, Tucker Edwards," Willa replied. "Thank you for a beautiful life. Thank you for our children and grandchildren. Thank you for every moment of these past 27 years." They sat together as darkness fell. 2 people who had started as strangers and become soulmates, who had built a family and a legacy that would continue long after they were gone. The wind carried the sounds of Miles City from a distance, the town they had helped build and shape over the decades. Inside the house, Clara was visiting with her own family, their granddaughter's laughter floating out through the open windows. Tomorrow Matthew would come by with his wife and children. The day after, Grace had promised to bring Sunday dinner. Their lives were full and rich, surrounded by the love they had cultivated. As the first stars appeared in the darkening sky, Tucker reflected on the journey that had brought them here. From grief and desperation to joy and fulfillment, from a practical arrangement to the deepest love he had ever known. 4 daughters had changed everything with their determination and their letters, reaching out into the unknown and finding the perfect person to complete their broken family. "What are you thinking about?" Willa asked, sensing his contemplation. "About how grateful I am," Tucker said honestly. "For you, for our children, for this life we built together. I never imagined I could be this happy again after Sarah died. You gave me back my joy, Willa. You and those 4 brave little girls who refused to accept that we had to stay sad forever. They saved us both," Willa agreed. "I was drowning in Philadelphia, going through the motions but not really living. Their letters threw me a lifeline. Coming here, marrying you, becoming a mother, it was like waking up after years of sleepwalking." They sat in comfortable silence, the kind that only comes from decades of companionship. Finally, as the night grew cold, they went inside together, Tucker's arm around Willa's shoulders, supporting each other as they had for so many years. That night, lying in bed with Willa curled against his side as she had been since their wedding night, Tucker felt a peace so profound it brought tears to his eyes. This was what life was meant to be. Not perfect, not without hardship or sorrow, but filled with love and purpose, and the deep satisfaction of knowing you had built something lasting. The years continued, bringing both joy and sorrow as years do. They lost friends and saw their children face their own struggles and triumphs. But through it all, Tucker and Willa remained each other's constant, the foundation upon which everything else was built. When Tucker finally passed in his sleep at the age of 78, Willa held his hand and whispered that she would see him again soon. She followed him 6 months later, dying peacefully surrounded by their children and grandchildren, her last words a quiet, "I am coming, Tucker. Wait for me." They were buried side by side in the cemetery on the hill overlooking Miles City, the same cemetery where Sarah and her infant son rested. The headstone read simply, Tucker Edwards, 1852–1930, and Willa Edwards, 1860–1930, beloved husband and wife, devoted parents and grandparents, but their true legacy was not in stone. It lived in their children and grandchildren, in the lessons they had taught about love and courage and second chances. It lived in the story that became family legend, told and retold at gatherings for generations to come. The story of 4 brave little girls who wrote letters asking for a mother, and the woman from Philadelphia who answered their call and changed all their lives forever. Margaret, now an old woman herself, would tell her grandchildren about that cold December day when Miss Willa stepped off the train, nervous and determined. She would describe how their father had fallen in love with their new mother slowly, and then all at once, how the house had transformed from a place of sadness to one of joy. She would talk about the baby brother who came and brought such happiness, and all the siblings who followed. Ruth would add stories about Willa's patience as a teacher, how she had guided them through their lessons, and their growing up with gentle firmness. Pearl would talk about how Willa had supported her dreams even when others said a woman could not be a doctor, how that encouragement had made all the difference. Grace, who had been too young to remember her birth mother, would simply say that Willa was the best mother anyone could ask for, that she had never felt anything but loved and cherished. The story of Tucker and Willa Edwards became part of Miles City's history, a reminder that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is reach out to a stranger and hope they will reach back. That love can grow in the most unlikely circumstances. That 4 determined little girls can change the course of multiple lives with nothing but paper and ink and desperate hope. Their descendants spread across Montana and beyond, carrying forward the legacy of faith and courage their great-grandparents had demonstrated. Some became ranchers like Matthew, others educators like Ruth, doctors like Pearl, craftspeople like Grace's husband. But all of them knew the story of their origins, the tale of how their family had been forged from loss and loneliness into something beautiful and enduring. Years later, when Miles City erected a historical marker celebrating the pioneers who had built the town, Tucker and Willa Edwards were among those honored. Not for any grand deed or dramatic achievement, but for the quiet heroism of building a good life, raising good children, and showing that love could triumph over grief and fear. The house, where they had raised their family, still stood for many years, eventually becoming a historical site. Visitors would walk through the rooms and marvel at how small it was, how simple, and guides would explain that within these walls, A marshal and a schoolteacher had created a home that became the foundation for generations of Edwards' descendants. But perhaps the most fitting memorial was less tangible. It lived in every family formed through courage and hope, every widow or widower who found love again, every child who benefited from a step-parent's devoted care. It lived in the understanding that family is not just about blood, but about choice and commitment and the daily decision to love even when it is hard. Tucker and Willa's story reminded people that answered prayers sometimes come in unexpected packages. That four little girls' desperate letters could reach across the country and find exactly the right person at exactly the right time. That a practical arrangement could become a great love story. That second chances are real and precious and worth the risk. In the end, that was their greatest gift, not just to each other or to their children, but to everyone who heard their story and found hope in it. Hope that it is never too late to start over, that love can find you in the most unlikely places, that courage and faith can transform loss into blessing. 4 daughters had prayed for a mother. A lonely woman had answered their letters. A grieving widower had opened his heart to the possibility of loving again. And from those simple acts of faith and courage, a legacy had been born that would endure for generations. A testament to the transformative power of love and the unexpected ways that prayers are sometimes answered. The story of Tucker and Willa Edwards lived on, passed down through their family, and shared with new generations as proof that sometimes the most extraordinary love stories begin with the simplest acts of faith: a letter written, a train boarded, a hand extended to a stranger who would become the most important person in your world. And in Miles City, Montana, where it all began, their memory remained alive in the streets they had walked, the church where they had married, the school where Willa had taught, and most importantly, in the hearts of those who knew that true love requires not just passion, but courage, commitment, and the willingness to believe that even in our darkest moments, hope can find a way.